Get out. Those were the first words Clara Vance heard from the man she'd traveled 800 miles to marry. Rowan Hale stood in the doorway of his crumbling cabin, rifle loose in one hand, eyes flat as winter stone. Behind him, Blackridge Mountain loomed, brutal, endless, unforgiving. This wasn't a home. It was a graveyard. But Clara had burned every bridge to get here. No money, no family, nowhere left to run. So she did the one thing no woman before her had done. She stayed. If you want to see how far survival can push two broken people, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city. I want to know how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop at the edge of a landscape that looked like it had been carved by something angry. Blackridge wasn't a town. It was a warning. A scattering of wooden structures huddled together against the wind, their paint long stripped away, their windows dark and watchful. Beyond them, the mountain rose like a wall between earth and sky, its slopes black with pine and scarred with stone. Clara Vance stepped down onto frozen ground, her boots crunching against gravel mixed with ice. The driver didn't meet her eyes as he tossed her single trunk onto the dirt. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, voice low and careful. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. "Hale's place is 3 miles north. Follow the ridge road till you see the fence." He paused, glanced toward the mountain, then back at her. "If you're smart, you'll get back on this coach." Clara pulled her coat tighter. "I'm not going back." The driver shrugged, climbed onto his seat, and snapped the reins. The stagecoach lurched forward, wheels grinding against stone, and within moments it was gone, swallowed by distance and dust. She stood alone in the cold. Around her, Blackridge seemed to hold its breath. A few faces appeared in windows, pale and still, watching without welcome. No one came out. No one called her name. The wind moved through the street like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of smoke and something older, something that had settled into the bones of this place and refused to leave. Clara lifted her trunk, the weight of it biting into her palms, and started walking. The ridge road was worse than she'd expected. Narrow, uneven, lined on one side by a slope that dropped away into darkness and on the other by towering pines that blocked out the sun. Her breath came in white clouds. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves. The trunk grew heavier with every step, but she didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant asking herself what the hell she was doing out here. She already knew the answer. She'd made a choice, a desperate one. A mail-order marriage to a man named Rowan Hale. A rancher, the advertisement had said, a landowner. A man of means seeking a practical woman for partnership and mutual benefit. It had sounded cold, transactional, exactly what she needed. Clara had written back immediately. No flowery language, no false promises, just the facts. She was 26, educated enough to keep books, strong enough to work, and had nowhere else to go. If he wanted someone who wouldn't faint at the sight of blood or dirt, she was his woman. His reply had been even shorter. "Come if you're serious, don't if you're not." And an address. That was it. No photograph, no sweet words, no reassurance. She'd packed everything she owned into one trunk and left the same week. Now, as the road curved and the trees thinned, she saw it. A fence. Old, crooked, but still standing. Beyond it, a cabin sat low against the hillside, its roof sagging under the weight of too many winters. Smoke rose thin and gray from the chimney. A single window glowed faintly in the failing light. Clara stopped at the gate. Her heart was pounding now, hard and fast. She told herself it was from the walk, from the cold, not from fear. She pushed the gate open. It creaked. The sound seemed to echo across the entire valley. The door opened before she reached it. Rowan Hale stepped out onto the porch, and Clara's first thought was that he looked like the mountain itself. Tall, dark, unmovable. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn flannel shirt. His face was sharp-edged and shadowed, covered partially by a dark beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. His eyes were pale, gray or blue, she couldn't tell in the dim light, and they locked onto her with the cold, assessing weight of a man who'd learned not to trust what he saw. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Clara stopped at the base of the porch steps, her trunk still in her hands, and met his gaze. "I'm Clara Vance," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You sent for me." Rowan's jaw tightened. He looked her over, not with interest, but with the flat mechanical evaluation of someone inspecting livestock. Then he turned, disappeared into the cabin, and returned a moment later with a canvas sack. He tossed it onto the porch between them. "There's a week's worth of supplies in there," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. "Enough to get you back to town. Stagecoach runs again in 6 days." Clara stared at the sack, then at him. "I don't understand." "You're not staying." The words hit like a slap. "I came here to marry you," Clara said, her voice harder now. "I sold everything I had. I traveled. I didn't ask you to. You sent a letter. I changed my mind." Silence dropped between them like a stone into deep water. Clara's fingers curled tight around the handle of her trunk. Anger flared hot in her chest, but she forced it down, forced herself to breathe, to think. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked quietly. "Anywhere that's not here." "I don't have anywhere." Rowan's expression didn't shift. "Not my problem." He turned to go back inside. "Wait." He stopped, didn't turn around. Clara's voice was calm now, colder. "I didn't come here because I thought you'd be kind. I came because I needed a roof and work. You need help running this place. I can see that much from the road. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to stay. I'm going to work. And if after a week you still want me gone, I'll leave." Rowan turned his head slightly, enough that she could see the edge of his profile. "You don't know what you're walking into." "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped back, pushed the door open wider, and nodded once toward the inside of the cabin. "1 week," he said. "After that, you're gone." Clara picked up her trunk and climbed the steps. The inside of the cabin was worse than the outside. It was a single room, low-ceilinged and thick with the smell of old smoke and damp wood. An iron stove squatted in one corner, barely throwing heat. A rough table sat near the center, cluttered with tin plates, a dented coffee pot, and what looked like weeks of unwashed dishes. A narrow bed was shoved against the far wall, its blankets gray and threadbare. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness anywhere. It looked like a place where someone had stopped trying. Clara set her trunk down near the door and turned to face Rowan. He stood with his arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "There's a loft," he said, nodding toward a ladder in the corner. "You can sleep up there." She glanced up. The loft was little more than a platform with a thin mattress and a wool blanket that had seen better days. "Fine. I leave before dawn. I'm usually back after dark. Stay out of my way." "And what am I supposed to do all day?" "Whatever you want. Just don't touch my things." Clara looked around the cabin, at the dirt on the floor, the dishes piled high, the cold pressing in through cracks in the walls. "Do you have cleaning supplies?" Rowan frowned. "Why?" "Because this place is filthy." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to surprise. "Do what you want," he said finally. Then he grabbed his coat from a peg by the door, pulled it on, and walked out into the night. The door shut behind him. Clara stood alone in the cold, silent cabin. She exhaled slowly. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Yeesh. By the time Rowan returned the next evening, the cabin had changed. The floor had been swept. The dishes were washed and stacked. The table was clear. The stove had been stoked and was now throwing real heat into the room. The air smelled faintly of lye soap and something else, something almost like bread. Rowan stopped in the doorway, his eyes moving slowly over the space. Clara stood near the stove, wiping her hands on a rag. She didn't smile, didn't greet him, just met his gaze and waited. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know." He set his rifle down by the door, pulled off his coat, and walked to the table. There was a plate there, beans, cornbread, and something that might have been dried venison cooked soft. "You made food." "I made enough for 2. Rowan stared at the plate for a long moment. Then he sat down, picked up a fork, and ate in silence. Clara turned back to the stove, her heart beating steady and slow. She didn't need him to thank her. She just needed him to let her stay. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm that was part routine, part standoff. Rowan left before dawn and returned after dark. Clara worked. She cleaned every surface, patched holes in the walls with cloth and mud, scrubbed the windows until light actually came through them. She found a root cellar beneath a trapdoor near the bed, half empty, but stocked with enough potatoes, onions, and dried meat to last a few more weeks if she was careful. She cooked. Not much. Just enough. Rowan never asked her to, never thanked her, but every night he ate what she made, and every night the silence between them grew a little less hostile. On the fourth morning, Clara woke before dawn and climbed down from the loft to find Rowan already awake, pulling on his boots by the stove. "I'm coming with you today," she said. He looked up sharply. "No. I need to see the land. If I'm going to stay—" "You're not staying. I need to know what's out there." Rowan stood, his jaw tight. "It's too cold. Too dangerous." "I've been cold before, and I'm not afraid of danger." "You should be." Clara crossed her arms. "Are you going to stop me?" They stared at each other. Finally, Rowan grabbed a second coat from the peg and tossed it to her. Keep up or get left behind. The land around the cabin was harsher than Clara had imagined. Rowan led her along a trail that cut through dense forest and opened onto a wide, frozen meadow. Beyond it, the mountain loomed, black and vast, its peaks hidden in cloud. The air was thin and biting, her lungs burned with every breath. Rowan moved like he was part of the landscape, steady, silent, sure-footed even on ice. Clara followed, her legs aching, her hands numb, but she didn't complain, didn't slow down. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley, and Rowan stopped. "That's the boundary," he said, pointing toward a line of trees far below. "Past that, you're on someone else's land. Don't cross it." "Whose land?" "Doesn't matter, just don't." Clara studied the valley. It was beautiful in a brutal way, wild, untouched, unforgiving. "What do you do out here?" she asked. "I check the traps, fix the fence, hunt when I need to." "That's it?" Rowan's eyes shifted toward her. "What else is there?" Clara didn't answer. She just looked out over the valley and wondered what kind of man chose to live this way, alone, in silence, with nothing but cold and work and the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. That night, for the first time, Rowan spoke without being asked. They were sitting at the table, Clara mending a tear in one of his shirts, Rowan cleaning his rifle. The fire crackled softly in the stove. "You're wasting your time," he said quietly. Clara didn't look up. "Doing what?" "Fixing things, cleaning, cooking." He paused. "Staying." "I told you, I have nowhere else to go. There's always somewhere." "Not for me." Rowan set the rifle down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes on her now. "What are you running from?" he asked. Clara's hand stilled. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. Not suspicion, not anger, just quiet, cautious interest. "Debt," she said finally. "My father died and left me with nothing but bills. I couldn't pay them. Couldn't sell the house. It wasn't worth enough. So I left." "And you thought marrying a stranger was a better option?" "I thought it was the only option." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, as if that made sense to him. "What about you?" Clara asked. "What are you running from?" His expression closed like a door slamming shut. "Nothing." "Liar." The word hung in the air between them. Rowan stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the night without another word. Clara sat alone in the warm cabin, the shirt still in her lap, and exhaled slowly. She'd pushed too far, but she didn't regret it. On the sixth morning, Clara woke to find Rowan already gone. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the note on the table. "Fence is down on the north side. I'll be back late. Stay inside." Clara read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Stay inside. She looked around the cabin, clean now, warm, almost livable. Then she pulled on her coat, laced up her boots, and walked outside. The garden was behind the cabin, hidden beneath a layer of dead weeds and frozen earth. Clara had noticed it days ago, but hadn't had time to investigate. Now, standing in the cold morning light, she saw what it had been. Rows. Careful, deliberate rows. Someone had planted this garden with intention, with hope, but it had been abandoned. Clara knelt and began pulling away the dead growth, her fingers stiff and clumsy in the cold. Beneath the weeds, she found the bones of the garden, old stakes, a rusted trowel, the faint outline of furrows in the soil. This had been loved once, and then left to die. Clara sat back on her heels, her breath misting in the air, and made a decision. She was going to bring it back. When Rowan returned that night, he found Clara in the garden. She was filthy, dirt smeared across her face, her hands raw and red, but she was smiling. Rowan stopped at the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Clearing the garden." "Why?" "Because it's here. It's dead." "Not yet." Rowan stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin without another word. But Clara didn't miss the way his shoulders had tensed, or the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. That night, Rowan didn't eat. He sat at the table staring at the plate Clara had set in front of him, but he didn't touch it. "You should leave that garden alone," he said quietly. Clara looked up from her own plate. "Why?" "Because it's not yours. It's not anyone's. It's just here. It was my wife's." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Clara set down her fork slowly. "I didn't know you were married." "I'm not. Not anymore." "What happened?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "She died." Silence. Clara didn't push, didn't ask for details. She just nodded slowly and said, "I'm sorry." Rowan stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and left. Again. Clara sat alone in the cabin, the fire crackling softly, and felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on everything. The next morning, Clara woke to find Rowan standing in the doorway of the cabin, silhouetted against the pale dawn light. "Your week's up," he said. Clara climbed down from the loft and faced him. "I know. Stagecoach comes today." "I know." Rowan's eyes searched hers. "So?" Clara took a breath. "I'm staying." "I told you." "I heard you, but I'm staying anyway." "Why?" "Because you need help. Because I have nowhere else to go. And because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because I think you're drowning out here, and I don't think you even know it." Rowan's face went hard. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." They stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the cold air streaming in through the open door. Finally, Rowan stepped back. "Do what you want," he said. "But don't expect me to make this easy." He walked out. Clara exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. She'd won. For now. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange, fragile rhythm settled over the cabin. Rowan still left before dawn and returned after dark. Clara still worked, cleaning, cooking, tending the garden that was slowly coming back to life beneath her hands. But something had shifted. Rowan stopped leaving notes. He started speaking in short, clipped sentences, mostly instructions, sometimes observations. "The stove's leaking smoke, needs patching. There's a storm coming, stock the wood. You're planting too early, soil's still frozen." Clara took it all in stride. She patched the stove, stocked the wood, kept planting anyway. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, Rowan stopped leaving the cabin the moment she entered a room. What? One night, 3 weeks after Clara had arrived, she came inside from the garden to find Rowan sitting at the table with a bottle of whiskey and 2 tin cups. He didn't look at her, just pushed one of the cups toward her. Clara sat down slowly. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "Nothing, just drink." She picked up the cup, took a sip, and felt the burn slide down her throat. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Rowan spoke. Her name was Emma. Clara didn't move. "We were married for 4 years. She was strong, stronger than me in a lot of ways. She wanted to make this place into something, a real home. She planted that garden, fixed up the cabin, made me believe we could actually do it." He paused, his fingers tight around the cup. "Then she got sick, fever. I rode to town for the doctor, but by the time we got back," he trailed off, his voice rough. "She died that night, in this cabin, in that bed." Clara's chest tightened. "I buried her on the ridge," Rowan continued, "and I told myself I'd never let anyone else get that close again, Because if you don't let people in, you don't have to watch them leave. He looked at Clara then, his eyes raw and unguarded. But you didn't leave. No, Clara said softly. I didn't. Why? Because I'm stubborn. And because... She hesitated, then met his gaze. Because I think you're worth staying for. Rowan's breath hitched, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't walk away. The next morning, Clara woke to find Rowan already outside. She pulled on her coat and stepped onto the porch. He was standing in the garden, just standing there, hands in his pockets, looking down at the rows Clara had cleared and the seeds she'd planted. She walked over slowly. I thought you said it was dead, she said. Rowan didn't look at her. I was wrong. Clara smiled, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a foundation. 2 days later, the riders came. There were 4 of them, rough men on tired horses, their faces hard, and their eyes cold. They rode up to the cabin just after noon, stopping at the fence line. Clara was in the garden. Rowan was inside. One of the men dismounted and walked toward her. This Hale's place? He asked. Clara straightened, her pulse quickening. It is. We're looking for him. He's not here. The man smiled. It wasn't friendly. That's fine. We can wait. Clara's mind raced. She knew men like this. She'd grown up around them, men who took what they wanted and didn't care who got hurt in the process. What do you want with him? She asked. That's between us and him. The other men were dismounting now, spreading out, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could run. She could hide. Or she could do something they wouldn't expect. She took a breath, wiped the dirt from her hands, and walked toward them. You boys look like you've been riding a while, she said calmly. I've got coffee on the stove. You're welcome to some. The men exchanged glances. The leader laughed. You serious? Dead serious. It's cold. You're tired. And whatever business you have with Rowan, it can wait 10 minutes. She turned and walked toward the cabin without waiting for an answer. Behind her, she heard the men hesitate. Then, slowly, they followed. Inside, Rowan was standing by the window, rifle in hand, his face dark with fury. What the hell are you doing? He hissed. Buying time, Clara whispered. Now, put that down and follow my lead. She poured coffee into 4 tin cups and set them on the table just as the men stepped inside. They looked around the cabin, clean, warm, almost welcoming, and some of the tension seemed to ease from their shoulders. Sit, Clara said. They sat. Rowan stood in the corner, his rifle leaning against the wall, his eyes locked on the men like a wolf watching prey. Clara poured herself a cup and sat down across from them. So, she said calmly, what brings you all the way out here? The leader took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. We're here about a debt. What kind of debt? The kind that gets paid one way or another? Rowan's jaw tightened. Clara didn't flinch. How much? $200. That's a lot of money. It is. And if he doesn't pay? The man smiled again. Then we take what's owed. Clara nodded slowly. Then she stood, walked to her trunk, and pulled out a small leather pouch. She set it on the table. There's $50 in there, she said. It's all I have. Take it as a down payment. Rowan will have the rest in 2 months. The men stared at her. You're paying his debt? One of them asked. I'm buying time. The leader picked up the pouch, weighed it in his hand, then looked at Rowan. 2 months, he said. Not a day more. He stood, motioned to the others, and they filed out. The door closed. Clara exhaled slowly, her hands shaking. Rowan was staring at her, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I know. That was your money. It was our money. Rowan crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Clara froze for a heartbeat. Then she wrapped her arms around him and held on tight. That night, they sat by the fire side by side, the silence between them softer than it had ever been. I'm not good at this, Rowan said quietly. At what? Letting people in. I know, but I'm trying. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the walls. The man who had loved and lost and buried his grief so deep he'd almost forgotten how to feel. "That's all I'm asking," she said. Rowan nodded, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara felt like she was home. Damn. The weeks that followed were hard. Rowan worked himself to exhaustion, taking extra jobs in town to scrape together the money they owed. Clara kept the cabin running, kept the garden growing, kept them both fed and warm. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And slowly, piece by piece, the cabin stopped feeling like a graveyard. It started feeling like a home. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountain, Clara stood in the garden and looked at the rows of green shoots pushing up through the soil. Rowan came up beside her. "It's working," he said quietly. "Yeah," Clara said, "it is." They stood there together side by side as the light faded and the stars began to appear, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. The garden became Clara's battlefield. Every morning, before the sun broke over the ridge, she was out there, hands buried in cold soil, coaxing life from land that had forgotten how to give it. The earth resisted. Frost came late into spring, killing the first shoots she'd planted. Rocks surfaced like bones through the dirt. The wind tore at the stakes she drove into the ground. But Clara didn't stop. She replanted, reinforced, dug deeper. Rowan watched from a distance at first, standing at the window with his coffee, his expression unreadable. Then one morning, Clara looked up from her work to find him walking toward her, a shovel in his hand. He didn't say anything, just drove the blade into the ground beside her and started turning the soil. They worked side by side in silence, the rhythm of their movements falling into sync, dig, turn, breathe. The sun rose higher. The air warmed, and for the first time since Emma had died, Rowan touched the garden again. When they finally stopped, hours later, Clara's back was screaming, and her hands were blistered raw. But the rows were cleared, the soil was loose and ready. Rowan leaned on his shovel, breathing hard, his face streaked with dirt. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. Clara looked at him. "Emma?" He nodded. "She would have liked that you didn't give up." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that would ease the weight she could see pressing down on him, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, she just reached out and squeezed his hand. Rowan squeezed back, and they stood there, two people bound by grief and dirt, and the stubborn refusal to let the mountain win. That night, Clara cooked a real meal for the first time in weeks: roasted potatoes, wild onions, and a rabbit Rowan had trapped the day before. The cabin filled with the smell of it, warm and rich, and almost unbearably comforting. Rowan ate slowly, savoring every bite, and when he was finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "You're a good cook," he said. Clara smiled. "Don't get used to it. I'm running out of supplies. I'll ride to town tomorrow, restock. Can we afford it?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "We'll make it work." Clara studied him. The debt hung over them like a storm cloud, $200, with only 50 paid and 2 months shrinking fast. Rowan hadn't said much about it since the riders left, but she could see it eating at him. He worked longer hours, took less food, slept even less than before. "Rowan," she said carefully, "we need to talk about the money." "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is. We need a plan." "I have a plan. Work, earn, pay." "That's not a plan, that's just grinding yourself into the ground." Rowan's eyes flashed. "What else do you want me to do, Clara? Rob a bank? Sell the land? This is all I've got." "You've got me." The words hung in the air between them. Rowan's expression softened, just slightly. "I know." "Then let me help, really help. Not just cooking and cleaning. Let me work. I can take in sewing, laundry, anything. There's got to be people in town who need—" "No." "Rowan, I said no." His voice was hard now, final. "I'm not dragging you into my mess any more than I already have. It's not just your mess anymore. We're in this together. You didn't sign up for this." "Yes, I did. The moment I stayed." Rowan stared at her, his hands curled into fists on the table. Then he stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the night. Clara sat alone in the warmth of the cabin, her heart pounding with frustration and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to fear. She was fighting for him. For them. for a future she hadn't even known she wanted until she'd found it here, in this cold, broken place. But she couldn't do it alone. The next morning, Rowan was gone before dawn. Clara found a note on the table. Going to town. Back by nightfall. Stay inside. She crumpled the note in her fist. Stay inside. Always stay inside. As if the world beyond the fence was too dangerous, too unpredictable for her to handle, Clara pulled on her coat, laced up her boots, and walked outside. The garden was waiting. She spent the morning planting beans, carrots, turnips. The seeds were precious, carefully rationed from the small store Rowan kept in the cellar. Each one she pressed into the soil felt like a promise, a bet against the mountain, a declaration that something here could grow, despite everything trying to kill it. By midday, her hands were raw and her knees were caked with mud, but the rows were full. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and looked at what she'd done. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something. A sound cut through the silence, hoofbeats coming fast. Clara's pulse jumped. She stood quickly, wiping her hands on her skirt, and turned toward the road. A single rider was approaching, moving at a hard gallop. As he got closer, Clara recognized him, one of the men from town, a wiry older man named Fletcher who ran the general store. He pulled up hard at the fence, his horse lathered and blowing. "Mrs. Hale?" he called. Clara walked toward him, her stomach knotting. "What is it?" "Your husband. There's been trouble." Her blood went cold. "What kind of trouble?" "Fight. Down at the saloon. He's hurt. Not bad, but he needs tending. I came to fetch you." Clara didn't hesitate. She ran to the cabin, grabbed her coat and a satchel, and climbed up behind Fletcher on his horse. They rode hard, the wind tearing at Clara's face, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. The town appeared on the horizon, small, gray, huddled against the base of the mountain. Fletcher guided the horse straight to the saloon and pulled up outside. Clara slid off and pushed through the door. The saloon was dim and smoky, smelling of whiskey and sweat. A handful of men stood clustered near the bar, talking in low voices. In the corner, slumped in a chair, was Rowan. His face was bruised, his knuckles split and bloody. His shirt was torn, and there was a cut above his left eye that was still bleeding. Clara's breath caught. She crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to her knees in front of him. "Rowan?" she said, her voice tight. "What happened?" He looked at her, his eyes dull with pain and something else. Shame. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You're not fine, you're bleeding. It's nothing. It's not nothing." She opened her satchel, pulled out a clean cloth, and pressed it against the cut on his forehead. He winced, but didn't pull away. One of the men at the bar stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a mean look in his eyes. "Your husband started it," he said. Clara didn't look at him. "I don't care who started it. He accused me of cheating." "Were you?" The man's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, woman." Clara stood slowly, her hand still holding the cloth against Rowan's head. She turned to face the man, her eyes cold and steady. "You're twice his size," she said quietly, "and you hit him while he was already down. That makes you a coward, not a winner." The saloon went silent. The man took a step toward her, his fists clenched. Rowan surged to his feet, swaying slightly, and put himself between Clara and the man. "Touch her," Rowan said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I'll kill you." The man hesitated. Then he spat on the floor and turned away. "Get out of my town!" Rowan didn't argue. He grabbed Clara's arm, steadied himself, and they walked out together. Outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Clara helped Rowan onto Fletcher's horse, then climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to keep him upright. "Thank you, Fletcher," she said. The old man nodded. "Get him home, Mrs. Hale, and keep him there." They rode back in silence, the sun sinking low behind the mountain. Rowan's body was tense against hers, his breathing shallow. Clara could feel him trembling, from pain, from exhaustion, from something deeper. When they reached the cabin, she helped him down and guided him inside. He collapsed into the chair by the table, his head hanging low. Clara lit the lamp, poured water into a basin, and set to work cleaning his wounds. "You're an idiot," she said quietly. Rowan didn't respond. "What were you thinking? Fighting in a saloon? Over cards?" "He was cheating." "I don't care if he was robbing you blind. You can't afford to get into fights, Rowan. Not now, not with the debt hanging over us. I know. Then why did you do it? Rowan finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. Because I'm tired, Clara. I'm tired of working myself to death and getting nowhere. I'm tired of watching you scrape by on nothing. I'm tired of... His voice broke. I'm tired of failing. Clara's hand stilled. She set down the cloth, cupped his face in her hands, and forced him to meet her eyes. You're not failing, she said firmly. You're fighting, and that's different. It doesn't feel different. I know, but it is. She kissed his forehead, just above the cut, and felt him exhale, long and shaky, like he'd been holding his breath for years. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Then he leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and they sat there in the lamplight, broken and bruised and still standing. Over the next week, Rowan healed slowly. His face remained swollen and discolored. His ribs ached with every breath, but he refused to stay in bed. He worked, carefully, slowly, repairing the fence, chopping wood, checking the traps. Clara watched him like a hawk, ready to step in if he pushed too hard. But she also gave him space. She understood, better than most, that pride was sometimes the only thing keeping a person upright. The garden began to show signs of life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, fragile and defiant. Clara tended them obsessively, watering them with snowmelt, shielding them from late frosts with scraps of cloth. Rowan watched her work, and slowly something shifted in him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he spoke. I want to show you something. Clara looked up. What? Come on. He stood, grabbed a lantern, and led her outside. They walked through the darkness, following a narrow trail that led up the slope behind the cabin. The air was cold and still, the stars impossibly bright above them. They reached a clearing at the top of the ridge, and Rowan stopped. There, beneath a lone pine tree, was a grave. The marker was simple, a wooden cross, weathered and worn, with Emma's name carved into it. Clara's breath caught. Rowan stood beside the grave, his hands in his pockets, his face shadowed. I come up here sometimes, he said quietly. When things get too heavy, I talk to her, tell her what's going on. He paused. I told her about you. Clara didn't know what to say. I told her you're stubborn and brave, and that you make me feel like maybe I'm not completely broken. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. Rowan turned to look at her. I loved her. I'll always love her. But she's gone, and I can't keep living like she's coming back. Rowan, I want to try, Clara, with you, for real. Not just surviving, but actually living. Clara crossed the space between them and took his hands in hers. I want that too, she whispered. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood there beneath the stars, two people learning how to let go of the past and reach for something new. The next morning, Rowan surprised her. He came into the cabin carrying a small wooden box, battered and old, and set it on the table. What's this? Clara asked. Open it. She lifted the lid. Inside were seeds, dozens of packets carefully labeled in neat handwriting. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, herbs. These were Emma's, Rowan said quietly. She saved them, planned to plant them the next spring, but he trailed off. I want you to have them. Clara's throat tightened. Rowan, I can't. Yes, you can. She would have wanted them used, not sitting in a box, forgotten. Clara looked down at the seeds, then up at him. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded. Then he picked up his hat and headed for the door. Where are you going? Clara asked. Town. I've got work to do. Be careful. He paused at the door, looked back at her, and smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. Always. Clara spent the day planting Emma's seeds. Each one felt sacred, weighted with memory and hope. She worked carefully, whispering silent thanks to the woman who had come before her, who had loved this land and this man and had tried to make something beautiful here. By the time the sun set, the garden was full. Clara stood at the edge of it, her hands covered in dirt, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. That night, Rowan came home with news. I got a contract, he said, setting a piece of paper on the table. Timber job. They need men to clear a section of forest up near the northern ridge. Pays well. Enough to cover the rest of the debt. Clara's heart leapt. That's incredible. It's dangerous work. I'll be gone for 2 weeks, maybe longer. I'll be fine. Rowan frowned. I don't like leaving you alone. I'm not afraid. You should be. There are animals, drifters. If anything happens, nothing's going to happen. Rowan looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but you keep the rifle by the door, and if anyone comes around, anyone, you don't answer. You stay inside and wait for me. Rowan, promise me, Clara. She sighed. I promise. He left 3 days later, before dawn, with a pack on his back and worry etched into every line of his face. Clara stood on the porch and watched him disappear into the trees. Then she went inside, bolted the door, and got to work. The first week alone was harder than Clara expected. The silence pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. Every creak of the cabin sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like voices. She slept with the rifle beside her bed and woke at every sound. But during the day she worked. She tended the garden, hauled water, chopped wood. She repaired a loose board on the porch, patched a hole in the roof, and reorganized the root cellar. She kept herself busy, kept herself moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant worrying. On the 8th day, a storm rolled in. It came fast and vicious, the sky turning black in minutes. Rain lashed the cabin, driven sideways by wind that howled like something alive. Clara bolted the shutters, stoked the fire, and sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, waiting it out. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second night, the roof started leaking. Water dripped steadily into a bucket Clara had placed beneath it, the sound sharp and rhythmic. She tried to patch it from the inside, but the rain was relentless. On the third night, the wind tore a section of the fence down. Clara heard it go, a sharp crack followed by the groan of wood splitting. She grabbed the rifle and the lantern and went outside. The rain was cold and brutal, soaking her to the skin in seconds. She stumbled through the mud toward the fence, holding the lantern high, and saw the damage. A section of posts had collapsed, knocked over by a fallen tree. The gate was hanging by a single hinge. Clara's stomach sank. If she didn't fix it, animals could get in. Drifters could get in. The garden could be destroyed. She set down the rifle and the lantern and got to work. It took her hours. Her hands were numb. Her clothes were soaked through. The rain beat down on her without mercy. But she lifted the posts, hammered them back into place, and secured the gate as best she could. By the time she stumbled back into the cabin, her entire body was shaking. She stripped off her wet clothes, wrapped herself in a blanket, and collapsed by the fire. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't rage. She just sat there, staring into the flames, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The next morning, the storm broke. The sun rose pale and weak, but it was there. Clara stepped outside and surveyed the damage. The fence was holding. The garden was battered, but alive. The cabin had weathered the worst of it. She had survived. That afternoon, she heard hoofbeats. Clara's pulse jumped. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. A single rider was approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, moving fast. Rowan. Clara set down the rifle and ran outside. He dismounted before his horse had even stopped, crossed the yard in 3 strides, and pulled her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he demanded, his hands framing her face, his eyes wild with worry. "I'm fine," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I'm fine. The storm. I tried to get back sooner, but the roads were washed out. I'm fine, Rowan. I handled it." He stared at her, taking in her bruised hands, her exhausted face, the fence she'd repaired on her own. Then he kissed her. It was fierce and desperate and full of everything he couldn't say. Clara kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, her heart pounding. When they finally pulled apart, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "I was so afraid," he whispered. "I know. Me too." They stood there, holding each other, as the sun climbed higher and the world slowly, carefully began to breathe again. That night, Rowan told her about the job. The timber work had been brutal, long days, dangerous conditions, men getting hurt. but he'd done it. He'd earned enough to pay off the debt. "We're free," he said quietly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "We're free." They sat by the fire, side by side, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. Freedom, Clara discovered, was heavier than debt. The morning after Rowan returned, they rode into town together. The sky was clear and cold, the kind of bright that made everything look sharper, more real. Clara sat behind Rowan on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against her cheek. Blackridge hadn't changed. The building still leaned into the wind. The streets were still empty save for a few wary faces in windows. But something felt different now. Clara wasn't arriving as a stranger desperate for refuge. She was arriving as someone who belonged. They stopped outside a squat building with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read Land Office. Rowan dismounted first, then helped Clara down. His hand lingered on hers for a moment. "You don't have to come in," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." Inside, the office was cramped and dim, smelling of old paper and tobacco smoke. A heavy-set man sat behind a desk covered in ledgers and maps, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up as they entered. "Hale," he said, his voice neutral. "Didn't expect to see you again." "I'm here to settle," Rowan said. The man raised an eyebrow. "You got the money?" Rowan pulled a leather pouch from his coat and set it on the desk. The man opened it, counted the bills slowly, then made a notation in one of his ledgers. "Debt's cleared," he said. "You're square." Rowan's shoulders dropped, just slightly, as if he'd been carrying a weight so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "There's one more thing," Rowan said. The man looked up. "I want to add her name to the deed, Clara Vance Hale, as co-owner." Clara's breath caught. She stared at Rowan, her heart pounding. The man's eyes shifted between them. "That's unusual." "I don't care if it's unusual. Can you do it or not?" "I can do it, but you're sure?" "Once it's done, I'm sure." The man shrugged, pulled out a fresh piece of paper, and began writing. When he was finished, he turned it toward them. "Both of you need to sign." Rowan signed first, his handwriting rough but clear. Then he handed the pen to Clara. She looked down at the paper, at her name written beside his, and felt something crack open inside her chest. This wasn't just a transaction. This was trust. This was partnership. This was Rowan saying, without words, that she wasn't temporary. She wasn't a guest. She was home. Clara signed her name with a steady hand. The man stamped the document, filed it away, and nodded. "You're official. Congratulations." They walked out into the sunlight, and Clara felt like she could breathe for the first time in months. Rowan stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face her. "I should have asked you first," he said. "Before I—" "No," Clara interrupted. "You shouldn't have. You did exactly the right thing." His eyes searched hers. Then he smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. "Let's go home," he said. On the ride back, Clara rested her head against Rowan's back and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She owned land. She had a home. She had a partner. She had a future. But as the cabin came into view, nestled against the slope with smoke rising thin from the chimney, Clara felt a new kind of pressure settling over her. Freedom meant possibility, and possibility meant choice, and choice meant risk. What came next wasn't survival anymore. It was something harder. It was building. That night, they sat at the table with a pot of coffee between them and a single candle burning low. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside, the cabin was warm and still. "We need to talk about what happens now," Clara said. Rowan looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What do you mean?" "I mean we're free of the debt, but we're not free of everything. We've got land, but barely any livestock. We've got a garden, but it won't feed us through winter. We've got a roof, but it leaks. We've got—" "I know what we've got, Clara." "Then you know we need a plan. A real one." Rowan set down his cup. "What are you thinking?" Clara pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket and unfolded it on the table. She'd been making notes all week, sketching ideas, calculating possibilities. "The garden's a start, but we need more than vegetables. We need livestock, chickens at least, maybe a cow if we can afford it. We need to expand the fence, reinforce the barn. We should think about planting hay. Maybe some wheat if the soil can take it. Rowan studied the paper, his expression unreadable. And money? He asked. Where's that coming from? We work, both of us. I can take in laundry, sewing, whatever people in town need. You keep doing timber jobs when they come up. We save every penny until we can buy what we need. That could take years. Then it takes years. Rowan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. You're talking about turning this place into a real homestead. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You know what that means, right? No breaks, no rest. Just work, day after day, until we're too old or too broken to keep going. Clara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. I know. And you still want to do it? Yes. Don't you? Rowan was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. They started the next morning. Rowan rode to town and came back with a crate of chickens, 6 scrawny hens and 1 mean-looking rooster. Clara built a coop from scrap wood and wire, her hands blistered and aching by the time she finished. The chickens settled in warily, pecking at the dirt and eyeing her with suspicion. They'll lay once they get used to the place, Rowan said, watching them. How long does that take? Couple weeks, maybe, if we're lucky. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt. We'll be lucky. Over the next month, they worked like people possessed. Rowan repaired the barn, replacing rotted boards and shoring up the foundation. Clara expanded the garden, planting row after row of potatoes, turnips, and cabbage. Together, they rebuilt the fence, driving posts deep into the frozen ground until their muscles screamed and their hands bled. It was brutal, relentless work, but it was theirs. And slowly, impossibly, the land began to respond. The garden grew thick and green. The chickens started laying. The cabin stopped feeling like a shell and started feeling like a place where people actually lived. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountain, Rowan spoke. I never thought I'd see this place like this again, he said quietly. Clara glanced at him. Like what? Alive. She didn't respond, just reached over and took his hand. They sat there in silence, watching the light fade, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But hope, she was learning, was a dangerous thing. It made you believe the worst was over. It made you forget that the mountain always had one more test. The trouble started 3 weeks later. Clara was in the garden, pulling weeds, when she heard the sound of hooves. She straightened, shielding her eyes against the sun, and saw a group of riders approaching, 5 men on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately. Her stomach tightened. Rowan was in the barn. She set down her tools and walked quickly toward him. Rowan, she called, we've got company. He emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants, and looked toward the riders. His expression went hard. Get inside, he said. No. Clara, I'm not hiding. Not this time. Rowan's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He just moved to stand beside her, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. The riders stopped at the fence. The man in front was tall and lean, with a sharp face and cold eyes. He wore a badge pinned to his vest. Rowan Hale, he called. That's me? The man dismounted and walked toward them, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Name's Carter. I'm a land agent for the Blackridge mining company. Rowan's expression didn't change. What do you want? Carter pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. This is a legal notice. The company's expanding operations into this territory. Your land sits on a mineral deposit. We're offering to buy you out. Not interested. Carter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You haven't heard the offer yet. Don't need to. This land's not for sale. Mr. Hale, I think you should reconsider. The company's prepared to be generous. I said no. Carter's smile faded. You're making a mistake. That's my business. The agent's eyes shifted to Clara, cold and assessing. And you, Mrs. Hale? You agree with your husband's decision? Clara lifted her chin. I do. Carter studied them both for a moment. Then he refolded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. The company doesn't take no for an answer, Mr. Hale. You do well to remember that. He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted. The group rode off without another word, their horses kicking up dust. Rowan and Clara stood in silence, watching them disappear. "What was that about?" Clara asked quietly. "Trouble," Rowan said, "the kind that doesn't go away." That night, Rowan told her the truth. The Blackridge mining company had been buying up land all over the territory for years. They offered low prices and used pressure, legal and otherwise, to force people out. Anyone who refused found themselves facing lawsuits, harassment, or worse. "They want this land?" Clara asked. "They want everything, the whole valley. They don't care who's living on it. Can they force us out?" "Not legally. Not if we hold the deed and pay our taxes, but that doesn't mean they won't try." Clara's chest tightened. "What do we do?" "We hold our ground, and we don't give them a reason to come back." But the company didn't need a reason. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things started happening. The fence was cut in 3 places, letting the chickens loose. Rowan spent hours tracking them down. The well was poisoned, something thrown in during the night that made the water taste bitter and foul. They had to haul fresh water from the creek a mile away until it cleared. One morning, Clara woke to find the garden trampled, boot prints everywhere, plants torn up by the roots. She stood in the middle of the destruction, her hands shaking, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Rowan came up beside her, his face dark with rage. "They're trying to break us," he said quietly. "They won't," Clara said, her voice hard. "Clara, they won't." She dropped to her knees and started replanting. Rowan watched her for a moment. Then he knelt beside her and helped. They worked in silence, side by side, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Again. A week later, the riders came back. This time, there were more of them, 7 men, armed and aggressive. They rode right up to the cabin and dismounted without asking. Clara was inside kneading dough for bread. Rowan was chopping wood. He set down the axe and walked toward them, his movement slow and deliberate. "You're trespassing," he said. Carter stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "We're here on official business." "I don't care what you call it. Get off my land." One of the men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? Not for long." Rowan's eyes went cold. "Leave. Now." Carter smiled. "Or what? You going to take on all of us, Hale?" Inside the cabin, Clara moved to the window. She could see the tension crackling in the air, could see Rowan's hands curling into fists. She grabbed the rifle, checked that it was loaded, and walked outside. Every head turned toward her. She didn't point the rifle at anyone, just held it loosely at her side, her finger resting near the trigger. "You heard my husband," she said calmly. "You're trespassing. You need to leave." Carter's eyes narrowed. "You planning to shoot us, Mrs. Hale?" "Only if you give me a reason." One of the men took a step toward her. Rowan moved faster, blocking his path. "Touch her," Rowan said, his voice deadly quiet, "and you won't walk away." The tension held for a long, breathless moment. Then Carter raised a hand, signaling his men to back off. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Clara said. "You came here to intimidate us, to make us afraid. But we're not afraid, and we're not leaving. So unless you want to start a fight you can't win, I suggest you get back on your horses and ride out." Carter stared at her, his jaw tight. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and motioned for his men to follow. They rode off, slowly, deliberately, their eyes locked on Clara and Rowan until they disappeared over the ridge. Clara's hands were shaking. She lowered the rifle, exhaled slowly, and felt her knees go weak. Rowan caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her steady. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough. "Yes, I should have. They could have killed you. They could have tried." Rowan pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes wild with fear and something else. Pride. "You're insane," he said. Clara smiled shakily. "I know." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and Clara kissed him back, tasting salt and fear and relief all mixed together. When they finally pulled apart, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "We can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "Sooner or later they're going to come back with more men, more guns, and we won't be able to stop them. Then we find another way." "What other way?" Clara pulled back, her mind racing. "We're not the only ones they're pressuring. There have to be other landowners fighting the same fight. If we band together, no one's going to stand up to the company, Clara. They're too powerful. Then we make them care. We go to town. We talk to people. We show them that if the company can do this to us, they can do it to anyone. Rowan stared at her. You think people will listen? I think they'll listen if we give them a reason to. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. All right, we try it your way. The next morning, they rode into Blackridge together. The town was quiet, as always, but Clara could feel eyes on them as they dismounted outside the general store. Fletcher was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of supplies. He looked up as they entered, his expression wary. Mrs. Hale, Rowan, what brings you in? We need to talk, Clara said. About the mining company. Fletcher's face went carefully blank. I don't get involved in that kind of thing. You don't have to get involved. I'm just asking you to listen. Fletcher sighed, glanced around the empty store, then nodded toward the back room. 5 minutes. That's all I've got. They followed him into a cramped office piled with ledgers and invoices. Fletcher leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Talk, he said. Clara told him everything. The visits from Carter, the sabotage, the threats, the pressure. When she finished, Fletcher was quiet for a long time. They've been doing this for years, he said finally. Buying up land, pushing people out. Most folks just take the money and leave. We're not taking the money, Rowan said. I know, and that's why you're in trouble. Fletcher rubbed his face, looking suddenly older. Look, I sympathize. I do. But what do you want me to do about it? Spread the word, Clara said. Tell people what's happening. Make them see that if we don't stand together, we'll all lose everything. And you think that'll work? I think it's the only chance we've got. Fletcher studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll talk to some folks. Can't promise anything, but I'll try. That's all we're asking, Clara said. They left the store and walked back to their horse. As Rowan helped Clara mount, she glanced back at the town, small, gray, holding its breath. You think it'll work? Rowan asked quietly. I don't know, Clara said, but we had to try. They rode home in silence, the mountain looming ahead of them, dark and unchanging. That night, as they lay in bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind moving through the trees. She'd made a gamble, a big one, and she had no idea if it would pay off. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The response came 3 days later, though not in the way Clara had expected. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 trees when she heard the wagon. The sound was different from horses, heavier, slower, the creak of wood and the jangle of harness chains. She turned, shielding her eyes against the morning sun, and saw it coming up the road. A farm wagon, pulled by 2 draft horses. And in the bed, surrounded by tools and supplies, sat 3 people. Rowan emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. But as the wagon drew closer, his posture relaxed slightly. That's the Johnsons, he said quietly. From the East Valley. The wagon pulled up near the fence, and a man climbed down, stocky and weathered, with gray threading through his dark hair. A woman followed, lean and sharp-eyed, and behind them a younger man who looked like a harder, quieter version of his father. Hale, the older man called. Hope we're not intruding. Rowan walked toward them, Clara close behind. Samuel, what brings you out here? Samuel Johnson glanced at his wife, then back at Rowan. Fletcher came by yesterday, told us about your trouble with the mining company. Clara's heart beat faster. Said you were looking to talk to folks. To organize. Samuel paused, his jaw tight. Well, we're listening. The woman stepped forward. I'm Margaret, she said, her voice direct and unflinching. And before you ask, yes, we've had visits too. 3 times in the last month. They want our land, offered half what it's worth and said we'd regret it if we didn't take the deal. Did you? Clara asked. Hell no, Margaret said flatly. That land's been in Samuel's family for 2 generations. We're not handing it over to some company that sees people as obstacles. The younger man spoke for the first time. Name's Ben. I don't know what you're planning, but if it means standing up to those bastards, we're in. Rowan looked at Clara. She could see the question in his eyes, the same question she'd been asking herself since they'd left town. Was this real? Could they actually do this? Come inside, Clara said. Let's talk. They gathered around the table in the cabin, the space suddenly feeling smaller with 6 people crowded into it. Clara made coffee while Rowan laid out a rough map of the valley on the table, marking properties with charcoal. The company's been targeting specific areas, Rowan said, pointing to clusters of marks, mostly along the ridge where the mineral deposits run. They've already bought out 4 families here, here, and here. And the ones who didn't sell? Samuel asked. Gone anyway. Couldn't handle the pressure. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes hard. So what's the plan? We can't just sit around waiting for them to pick us off one by one. Clara set the coffee pot on the table and sat down. We need to make it too costly for them to keep pushing. Right now, they're counting on us being isolated, scared, easy to intimidate. And if we're not, Ben asked, then they have to choose, back down or escalate. And escalation means witnesses, it means attention, it means risk. Samuel rubbed his jaw, thinking, you're talking about making ourselves visible, going public with what they're doing. Exactly. That's dangerous, Margaret said. The company has lawyers, they have money, they have connections. I know, Clara said. But what's the alternative? Let them take everything without a fight? Silence settled over the table. Finally, Samuel nodded. All right, what do you need from us? Over the next 2 hours, they hammered out a strategy. It was rough, uncertain, built more on hope than experience. But it was something. They would document everything, every visit from the company, every act of sabotage, every threat. They would talk to other landowners, quietly at first, building a network of people willing to stand together. And when the time came, they would take their case to the territorial governor. It's a long shot, Rowan said quietly. Maybe, Clara replied, but it's the only shot we've got. Before the Johnsons left, Margaret pulled Clara aside. You've got courage, she said quietly. But courage gets people killed if they're not careful. You watch your back, Mrs. Hale. The company doesn't play fair. I know. Do you? Margaret's eyes were sharp, searching. Because once you start this, there's no walking away. They'll come after you harder than anyone else. Clara met her gaze steadily. Then let them come. Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fletcher was right about you. You're a hell of a lot tougher than you look. She climbed back onto the wagon, and the Johnsons rode off, leaving Clara and Rowan standing alone in the yard. You sure about this? Rowan asked. Clara turned to face him. Are you? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant ridge where Emma was buried. Then he looked back at Clara. Yeah, he said. I am. The next week brought more visitors. The Hendersons arrived on horseback, a couple in their 50s with a daughter barely out of her teens. They'd been offered money to leave and had refused. 2 days later, their barn had burned down. We lost everything, Mr. Henderson said, his voice hollow. Livestock, tools, winter stores, all of it. Did you report it? Clara asked. He laughed bitterly. To who? The sheriff's in the company's pocket. We're on our own. Clara wrote down everything he told her, adding it to the growing stack of testimonies she was collecting. Each story was the same: pressure, threats, violence. A pattern of intimidation designed to break people's will. But instead of breaking, the valley was beginning to harden. More families came forward: the Coopers, the Driscolls. A widower named Thomas Harlan, who'd held his ground alone for 3 years. Each one brought their story, their anger, and their willingness to fight. Clara turned the cabin into a makeshift headquarters. She organized the testimonies, created maps showing which properties had been targeted, and drafted a letter to the territorial governor outlining the company's tactics. Rowan watched her work late into the night, hunched over the table by candlelight, her hand cramping from writing. You need to rest, he said one evening. I will, when this is finished. Clara, I can't stop, Rowan, not now. Every day we wait is another day they can hurt someone else. He knelt beside her chair and took her hand. I know. But if you work yourself to death, what good does that do anyone? Clara looked at him, at the worry etched into his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. He was carrying his own weight, taking on extra work to keep the homestead running while she organized the resistance. They were both running on fumes. 1 more hour, she said quietly. Then I'll stop. Rowan nodded and stood. I'll make coffee. But as he turned toward the stove, they both heard it, the sound of breaking glass. Rowan spun, his hand going to his knife. Clara grabbed the rifle propped against the wall. A rock lay on the floor near the window, shards of glass scattered around it. Wrapped around the rock was a piece of paper. Clara crossed the room and picked it up, careful of the glass. She unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled in crude letters. Stop or burn. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath didn't catch. She just folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. They're getting desperate, she said. Rowan stared at the broken window, his jaw clenched tight. This is a warning. I know. Clara, maybe we should… No. Her voice was steel. We're not stopping, we're not backing down, and we're sure as hell not burning. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. Whoever had thrown the rock was long gone, swallowed by the night. But the message was clear. They were being watched. The next morning, Rowan boarded up the broken window and reinforced the others. Clara sent word through Fletcher to the families they'd been organizing. Be vigilant, watch for trouble, don't travel alone. The valley felt different now, tighter, more tense, like a spring wound too far, ready to snap. 2 days later, Clara and Rowan rode to the Johnson farm to discuss their next move. They found Samuel in the yard, chopping wood with mechanical fury. Margaret was on the porch, her rifle across her lap. They came again last night, Samuel said without preamble. 6 men tried to run off our horses. Did they succeed? Rowan asked. No, Ben and I drove them off, but it's only a matter of time before they try something worse. Clara dismounted and walked toward Margaret. Are you all right? Margaret's eyes were hard and cold. I'm fine, but I'm done waiting. We need to move now before someone gets killed. The letter's ready, Clara said. I'm taking it to the territorial capital next week. That's too long. It's the fastest we can move. The governor's office is 3 days' ride from here. I need time to see… We don't have time, Margaret interrupted. Every day we wait, they get bolder. We need to act. And do what? Clara asked. Start a war? That's exactly what they want. They're trying to provoke us into doing something stupid so they can claim we're the aggressors. Samuel set down his axe. She's right, Margaret. We can't give them an excuse. Then what do we do? Margaret demanded. Sit here and let them pick us apart? We stick to the plan, Clara said firmly. We document everything. We stay together. And we take our case to someone who can actually do something about it. Margaret stared at her, frustration radiating from every line of her body. Then she stood, walked into the house, and slammed the door behind her. Samuel sighed. She's scared. We all are. I know, Clara said, but fear makes people reckless, and we can't afford reckless right now. They stayed at the Johnson farm until evening, discussing logistics and contingencies. By the time Clara and Rowan rode home, the sun was setting and shadows were stretching long across the valley. They were halfway back when they smelled the smoke. Rowan pulled the horse to a stop, his head turning toward the ridge. That's coming from our direction. Clara's stomach dropped. Ride now! They pushed the horse hard, racing through the twilight, the smell of smoke growing stronger with every stride. As they crested the final hill, Clara's worst fear materialized before her eyes. The barn was on fire. Flames roared from the roof, consuming the old wood like paper. The chickens were scattering in panic, squawking and fleeing into the trees. Rowan was off the horse before it stopped, running toward the barn. Rowan, no! Clara screamed, but he was already inside, disappearing into the smoke. Clara jumped down and ran toward the well, grabbing the bucket. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the rope. She hauled up water, ran toward the barn, and threw it at the base of the flames. It was useless. The fire was too big, too fast. Rowan emerged from the smoke, coughing, his arms full of tools and harness. He dropped them in the dirt and turned back. Rowan, it's gone, Clara shouted. Let it go. He ignored her, running back inside. Clara's heart stopped. She grabbed another bucket of water and ran to the entrance, the heat hitting her like a physical blow. Rowan! He appeared again, dragging a saddle, his face black with soot. The roof groaned above them, timbers cracking. Clara grabbed his arm. It's going to collapse. We need to get out. Rowan looked at the barn, at everything he'd built, everything he'd saved, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then the roof gave way with a roar like thunder. Clara yanked him backward, and they fell together into the dirt as the barn collapsed in on itself, sending a pillar of sparks shooting into the darkening sky. They lay there, breathing hard, covered in ash, and watched it burn. Clara's chest felt hollow. All that work. All those hours spent repairing, rebuilding, hoping. Gone. Rowan sat up slowly, his hands curled into fists, his eyes locked on the flames. "They did this," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "They came onto our land and burned it down." Clara pushed herself up, her whole body trembling. "We'll rebuild." "With what? We don't have the money. We don't have the materials. We don't—" His voice cracked. "We can't keep doing this, Clara. We can't keep losing." Clara grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "We're not losing," she said fiercely. "They want us to break. They want us to give up and walk away. But we're not going to. Do you hear me? We are not going to." Rowan's eyes searched hers, wild with pain and fury and desperation. Then he pulled her close, burying his face in her shoulder, and for the first time since she'd known him, she felt him shake with something that might have been tears. Clara held him, her own tears streaming down her face as the barn burned to ash behind them. They spent the night hauling water to keep the fire from spreading to the cabin. By dawn, all that remained of the barn was a smoking ruin. Blackened timbers and twisted metal, everything else consumed. Clara stood in the yard, exhausted and numb, staring at the destruction. Rowan came up beside her, his face drawn and hollow. "I'm riding to town," he said quietly. "I'm filing a complaint with the sheriff." "Rowan, the sheriff won't—" "I know, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm making them answer for this." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it was pointless, that the sheriff was bought and paid for, that all it would do was put a target on their backs. But she could see in his eyes that he needed this, needed to fight back in some way, even if it was futile. "I'm coming with you," she said. They rode into Blackridge at mid-morning, their clothes still reeking of smoke, their faces streaked with ash. People stopped and stared as they passed, but no one spoke. The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town, its windows dirty and its door hanging slightly crooked. Rowan pushed it open and walked inside. The sheriff was a broad man with thinning hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from boredom to irritation. "Hale, what do you want?" "I'm here to report a crime," Rowan said. "Someone burned down my barn last night." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "That so?" "Yes." "You see who did it?" "No, but I know who's responsible." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "And who's that?" "The Blackridge Mining Company." The sheriff laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You got proof?" "They've been harassing us for weeks, sabotaging our property, threatening us. Last night they—" "You got proof?" the sheriff repeated, his voice harder now. Rowan's jaw clenched. "No." "Then there's nothing I can do. You could investigate." "Investigate what? A barn fire? Could have been lightning, could have been a spark from your stove, could have been your own damn carelessness." Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "It wasn't carelessness, it was arson. And if you won't investigate, we'll take this to the territorial governor." The sheriff's eyes shifted to her, cold and measuring. "You do that, Mrs. Hale. See how far it gets you." Rowan took a step toward the desk, his fists clenched. "You're supposed to protect people, to uphold the law. I uphold the law just fine, but I don't waste time on fairy tales from folks who can't prove what they're saying." Clara put a hand on Rowan's arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. "Let's go." "Clara, let's go," she said again, firmer this time. Rowan stared at the sheriff for a long, dangerous moment. Then he turned and walked out, Clara following close behind. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright, too normal. Clara's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from rage. "He knows," Rowan said quietly. "He knows exactly what's happening, and he doesn't care. Because he's being paid not to care." Rowan turned to her. "Then what do we do?" Clara took a breath, steadying herself. "We go over his head. We take this all the way to the Capitol. We make so much noise they can't ignore us." "And if they do?" Clara met his eyes, her expression hard and unyielding. "Then we make them regret it." They rode home in silence, the weight of what they were facing pressing down on them like the mountain itself. But as the cabin came into view, still standing, still theirs, Clara felt something shift inside her, The company had tried to break them, tried to scare them into submission, but all they'd done was make her angrier. And anger, Clara was learning, could be just as powerful as hope. That night, she finished the letter to the governor. It was 20 pages long, meticulously detailed, and included testimonies from 8 families. She sealed it carefully and set it on the table. Rowan was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "I'm leaving for the capital in 2 days," Clara said. He looked up. "I'm coming with you." "No, you need to stay here. Watch the property. Make sure they don't burn anything else." "I'm not letting you ride 3 days alone." "Rowan." "No, Clara." His voice was firm, final. "We're in this together. That means we don't split up, not now." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes, the need to protect her, even when protecting her meant putting himself at risk. "All right," she said quietly. "Together." He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Clara pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt the last of her fear burn away. They'd lost the barn. They'd been threatened, harassed, and pushed to the edge, but they were still standing, and as long as they were standing, they could fight. They left before dawn 2 days later, the letter secured in Clara's satchel, and enough supplies strapped to their horse to last the journey. The morning was cold and still, the kind of quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. Rowan helped Clara mount, then swung up behind her. As they turned the horse toward the road, Clara looked back at the cabin one last time. The garden was green and thriving despite everything. The chickens had returned and were pecking at the ground near the ruined barn. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney. It looked fragile, vulnerable, but it was still standing. They rode hard for 3 days, stopping only to rest the horse and catch a few hours of sleep. The landscape changed as they moved east, the brutal peaks of Blackridge giving way to rolling hills and then to flatter, more populated country. Towns appeared more frequently, proper towns with shops and schools, and people who didn't look at strangers with suspicion. On the 3rd evening, they reached the territorial capital. It was bigger than anything Clara had seen in months, a sprawling grid of streets lined with brick buildings, gaslights flickering to life as the sun set. The noise was overwhelming after the silence of the valley. Wagons clattered over cobblestones. People called to each other from windows and doorways. Somewhere, a piano was playing. "Where do we start?" Rowan asked quietly. Clara pulled out the folded instructions Fletcher had given her, directions to the governor's office and the name of a clerk who might be sympathetic to their cause. "City Hall," she said. "Tomorrow morning. Tonight we find somewhere to sleep." They found a modest boarding house near the edge of town. The proprietor, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper questions, took their money and led them to a small room on the 2nd floor. It was clean and warm, with a real bed and curtains on the windows. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The weight of everything they were trying to do pressed down on her like a physical thing. What if the governor wouldn't see them? What if he did see them but didn't care? What if they'd come all this way for nothing? Rowan sat beside her and took her hand. "We'll make them listen," he said quietly. "How can you be sure?" "Because you're the one doing the talking, and I've never seen you fail at something you set your mind to." Clara looked at him, at this man who had tried so hard to push her away and had instead found himself bound to her in ways neither of them had planned. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. Rowan squeezed her hand. "Then we go home and we keep fighting, but at least we'll know we tried everything." The next morning, they dressed in their cleanest clothes and walked to City Hall. The building was imposing, 3 stories of gray stone with tall columns flanking the entrance. Clara felt small as they climbed the steps, but she forced her shoulders back and her chin up. Inside, the lobby was all polished wood and echoing footsteps. A clerk sat behind a desk near the stairs, shuffling papers with mechanical efficiency. Clara approached him. "I'm here to see the governor." The clerk didn't look up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but then you'll need to file a request. Forms are on the table by the door. Processing takes 4 to 6 weeks." "I don't have 6 weeks." The clerk finally looked up, his expression bored. "That's not my problem, ma'am." Clara set her satchel on the desk and pulled out the letter. "This is an urgent matter concerning illegal land seizures, arson, and corruption in Blackridge County. The governor needs to see it." "I'm sure he does." "File a request." Rowan stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not listening. People are being hurt. Property is being destroyed. If the governor doesn't act, then he'll deal with it when your request is processed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Clara felt Rowan's anger radiating beside her. She put a hand on his arm, then leaned toward the clerk. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. The clerk blinked. "What?" "Your name. I want to know who to mention when I tell the territorial newspaper that the governor's office refused to hear testimony about a mining company burning down homesteads and terrorizing families." The clerk's expression shifted, just slightly, from boredom to uncertainty. "I'm not refusing anything. I'm following procedure. And I'm following mine. Which paper would you recommend? The Herald or the Tribune?" The clerk stared at her. Then he sighed, stood, and gestured toward a row of chairs against the wall. "Wait here. I'll see what I can do." They waited for over an hour. Clara sat with the letter in her lap, her hands folded over it, her mind running through everything she wanted to say. Beside her, Rowan sat tense and watchful, his eyes tracking every person who walked through the lobby. Finally, the clerk returned. "The governor's deputy will see you, third floor, end of the hall. You have 15 minutes. Clara stood, her heart pounding. "Thank you." The deputy governor was a lean man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, measured manner of someone who'd spent years navigating political waters. His office was smaller than Clara had expected, lined with shelves full of law books and stacks of documents. He gestured for them to sit. "I'm Deputy Governor Harlan Mitchell," he said. "I understand you have concerns about activities in Blackridge County." Clara handed him the letter. "It's all documented here. Testimonies from 8 families, evidence of sabotage, threats, and arson. The Blackridge Mining Company is using illegal tactics to force landowners off their property." Mitchell opened the letter and began reading. His expression didn't change as he moved through the pages, but Clara saw his jaw tighten slightly. When he finished, he set the letter down and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly. "This is substantial," he said finally. "It's the truth. I don't doubt that, but you need to understand the position we're in. The Blackridge Mining Company is one of the largest employers in the territory. They have significant political influence." Clara's stomach sank. "So you're not going to do anything?" "I didn't say that." Mitchell put his glasses back on and looked at her directly. "What I'm saying is that taking action against them requires more than testimony. It requires ironclad evidence, documentation, witnesses willing to testify in court. We have witnesses, 8 families ready to... Who can afford to travel here, to pay for lawyers, to fight a company with unlimited resources?" Mitchell's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Hale, I believe you. But belief isn't enough in a courtroom." Rowan leaned forward. "Then what do we need?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he pulled a piece of paper from his desk and began writing. "There's a territorial marshal named Jacob Stone. He's independent, doesn't answer to local law enforcement, and doesn't take bribes. If anyone can investigate this properly and gather the kind of evidence that will hold up in court, it's him." He handed the paper to Clara. It was a letter of introduction, bearing the deputy governor's seal. "Take this to Marshal Stone. Tell him I sent you. He'll listen." Clara stared at the letter, hope and skepticism warring in her chest. "And if he investigates and finds what we say is true, then the company will face consequences, real ones. But you need to understand, this will take time, months, possibly longer. And in the meantime, you'll be targets." "We're already targets," Clara said quietly. Mitchell nodded slowly. "Then be careful. And don't give them any reason to claim you're the aggressors. The moment you do, this all falls apart." They left City Hall with the letter clutched in Clara's hand and a new destination. Marshal Stone was based 2 days' ride to the north. They had just enough money left for supplies and the journey. As they walked back to the boarding house, Rowan spoke. "You believe him? That this marshal can help?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, "but it's more than we had this morning." That night, as they lay in the narrow bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had brought them here, the choices, the risks, the slow, grinding weight of fighting against something so much bigger than themselves. "Rowan?" she said quietly. "Yeah? If this doesn't work, if we go home and nothing changes, Would you regret it? Fighting this hard? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he rolled toward her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. No, he said, because even if we lose, we didn't just lie down and take it. We fought, and that matters. Clara squeezed his hand. I love you. The words hung in the air between them, the first time either of them had said it out loud. Rowan's breath caught. Then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. I love you too, he whispered. More than I thought I could love anything again. They held each other in the darkness, and Clara felt something settle deep in her chest. Whatever came next, whatever they had to face, they would face it together. And that was enough. They found Marshall Stone in a small frontier town called Copper Creek. His office was a single room attached to the back of the general store, sparse and functional. The marshal himself was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and forgotten none of it. Clara presented the deputy governor's letter. Stone read it slowly, then looked at them. You're the folks from Blackridge. Yes, sir. And you're claiming the mining company is running you off your land. Not claiming, stating fact. Stone leaned back in his chair. Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. They talked for over 2 hours. Clara presented every piece of documentation she'd gathered, the testimonies, the timeline of harassment, the evidence of sabotage. Stone listened without interrupting, making notes in a small leather journal. When they finished, he set down his pen and looked at them. This is serious, he said. If even half of what you're saying is true, the company's broken multiple territorial laws. But I need to investigate. That means I'll be coming to Blackridge, talking to witnesses, examining properties, and that means the company will know what's happening. We understand, Clara said. Do you? Because once I start this investigation, there's no stopping it, and the company will fight back. Hard. Let them fight, Rowan said. We're not backing down. Stone studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, I'll ride to Blackridge next week. In the meantime, you go home. You stay quiet. You don't provoke them. And you document everything they do. Understood? Understood. They left Marshall Stone's office with something they hadn't had in months. A chance. The ride home felt different, lighter somehow, despite everything still waiting for them. Clara found herself noticing things she'd missed on the way out. Wildflowers growing along the roadside, the way the light moved through the trees, the distant call of birds. You're smiling, Rowan said. Clara hadn't realized. I think I'm hopeful. Dangerous thing, hope. I know, but I'll take it anyway. They reached Blackridge late on the 6th day, just as the sun was setting behind the mountain. The valley looked the same, dark and endless and unforgiving. But as they rode toward the cabin, Clara saw something that made her heart catch. Lights. Multiple lights, flickering in the darkness near their property. Rowan's hand moved to his rifle. Stay behind me. As they drew closer, the lights resolved into lanterns, and the shapes around them became people. Samuel and Margaret Johnson, the Hendersons, the Coopers, Ben Johnson and Thomas Harlan. Nearly a dozen people, all gathered in Clara and Rowan's yard. Samuel stepped forward as they dismounted. We heard you were coming back tonight, he said. Thought you might need some help. Help with what? Clara asked. Margaret gestured toward the burned barn. Rebuilding. We brought lumber, tools, supplies. Figured if we all work together, we can have the frame up in a week. Clara's throat tightened. You don't have to. Yes, we do, Samuel interrupted. You're fighting for all of us. Least we can do is make sure you have a barn while you do it. Clara looked at Rowan. He was staring at the gathered families, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. That night, they told everyone about Marshall Stone and the investigation. There was cautious optimism, tempered by the knowledge that the company wouldn't go down without a fight. They'll escalate, Margaret said. The moment the marshal shows up, they'll know we're serious. Then we stay together, Clara said. We watch each other's backs, and we don't give them an inch. Over the next week, the barn rose from the ashes. The work was hard and communal, families taking turns bringing food, lending tools, staying late to help with the heavy lifting. Children played in the yard while their parents hammered and sawed. The sound of construction filled the valley, a defiant counterpoint to the silence the mountain tried to impose. Clara worked alongside them, her hands blistered and her back aching, but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. This was what community looked like. This was what standing together meant. Rowan watched her one evening as she handed out cups of water to the workers, smiling and laughing despite her exhaustion. "She's changed this place," Samuel said, coming to stand beside him. "She's changed me," Rowan replied quietly. Emma would have liked her. Rowan glanced at Samuel, surprised. Few people ever mentioned Emma's name around him. "Yeah," he said softly. "She would have." Marshal Stone arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding into the valley with 2 deputies and an air of quiet authority. He spent 3 days interviewing families, examining burned buildings, and documenting evidence. The company's hired men watched from a distance but didn't interfere. Not yet. On the 4th day, Stone came to Clara and Rowan's cabin. "I've got enough," he said. "More than enough, actually. I'm filing formal charges against the Blackridge Mining Company for intimidation, arson, and illegal land seizure attempts." Clara's hands trembled. "What happens now?" "Now it goes to the territorial court. There'll be a trial. You'll need to testify, along with the other families. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But if the evidence holds, and it will, the company will face serious consequences." "Will they go to prison?" Rowan asked. "Some of them, probably. The ones who ordered the violence. The rest will pay fines, lose their licenses to operate in this territory. Either way, they won't be able to touch your land again." That night, Clara and Rowan stood on their porch and watched the sun set over the valley. The new barn stood tall and solid behind them, its fresh timber still smelling of pine. The garden was thick with growth. The chickens were settling in for the night. "We did it," Clara said softly. "Not yet. Still got the trial. We will, though. We'll win." Rowan pulled her close. "How are you so sure?" "Because we have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth, and people willing to fight for it." The trial took place 3 months later in the territorial capital. The courtroom was packed, families from Blackridge filling the benches, reporters scribbling in notebooks, company lawyers sitting stone-faced at their table. Clara testified first. She spoke clearly and calmly, walking the jury through every incident, every threat, every act of sabotage. When the company's lawyer tried to rattle her with aggressive questioning, she didn't flinch. "Mrs. Hale, isn't it true that you're a relative newcomer to Blackridge? That you have no real understanding of how business is conducted in the territory?" "I understand the difference between business and crime," Clara replied, "and what your clients did was criminal." One by one, the other families testified. Samuel Johnson described finding his horses run off. The Hendersons showed photographs of their burned barn. Thomas Harlan presented a stack of threatening letters. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted 2 weeks. When the jury returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Clara felt Rowan's hand grip hers, felt tears streaming down her face. Around them, families were embracing, crying, celebrating. They had won. The judge sentenced 3 company executives to prison terms and imposed massive fines on the Blackridge Mining Company. Their territorial operating license was revoked. The land seizure efforts were declared illegal, and all families were granted clear title to their properties. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Clara gave a brief statement, her voice steady. This wasn't about one family or one homestead. This was about standing up for what's right, about refusing to let power and money trample over justice, and about proving that when ordinary people stand together, they're not so ordinary after all. The journey home took 4 days, but it felt like flying. When they finally rode into the valley, the sun was setting and everything was painted gold. The cabin looked warm and welcoming. The barn stood strong. The garden was bursting with vegetables ready for harvest. Clara slid off the horse and walked to the garden, kneeling in the dirt and running her hands over the leaves. "We made it," she whispered. Rowan knelt beside her. "We did. What do we do now?" "Now? We live." That autumn was the best either of them could remember. The harvest was bountiful, more than enough to see them through winter with plenty to sell in town. The Johnsons helped them acquire a milk cow, and the Coopers traded them a young pig. The barn filled with hay and supplies. Clara started teaching reading and writing to some of the valley children twice a week. Rowan took on apprentices, teaching young men the skills they'd need to work their own land. The homestead became a gathering place, families stopping by for advice, for companionship, for the simple reassurance that they weren't alone. One evening in late October, as the first snow began to fall, Clara and Rowan sat by the fire. She was mending one of his shirts. He was sharpening his knife. The cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need words to feel connected. "You ever think about that first day?" Rowan asked suddenly. Clara looked up. "When you told me to leave?" "Yeah, all the time. I was an idiot." Clara smiled. "Yes, you were. I'm glad you didn't listen to me. I'm glad I didn't either." Rowan set down the knife and crossed to where she sat. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "A home, a partner, a reason to wake up in the morning. You gave me all of that, Clara. You saved me." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "We saved each other." He kissed her then, soft and tender, and Clara felt the last piece of armor around her heart crack open and fall away. They had both come to this mountain broken, alone and desperate and convinced they had nothing left to lose. But somewhere in the cold and the silence and the endless work of survival, they had found something neither of them had been looking for. They had found each other, and they had built something that would last. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, and the valley turned green almost overnight. Clara planted Emma's seeds again, tomatoes and peppers and herbs, alongside her own. The garden exploded with life. One morning, as she was working in the soil, she felt Rowan's hand on her shoulder. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." He led her up the ridge to Emma's grave. The wooden cross had weathered, but still stood strong. Wildflowers had grown up around it, turning the clearing into something beautiful. Rowan knelt and placed a hand on the earth. "I wanted to tell her," he said quietly, "that I'm all right now, that the land is thriving, that I found someone who loves this place as much as she did." He looked up at Clara. "I think she'd be happy." Clara knelt beside him and laid her own hand on the grave. "Thank you," she whispered, "for loving him first, for teaching him that this place could be a home. We're taking care of it, I promise." They stayed there for a long time, two people honoring the past while building a future. When they finally walked back down the ridge, hand in hand, Clara looked out over the valley spread below them. The cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, the barn solid and strong, the garden green and growing, the mountain rising behind it all, dark and eternal. This was her home now. Not by accident or desperation, but by choice. She had come here with nothing, no money, no plan, no hope, and she had found everything. The mountain hadn't changed. It was still brutal and unforgiving, still testing everyone who tried to make a life on its slopes. But Clara had changed, Rowan had changed, and together they had proven something the mountain couldn't break. That love, partnership, and sheer stubborn determination could turn even the hardest ground into fertile soil. That a home wasn't just walls and a roof, it was the people inside it, fighting for each other. That sometimes the best things in life came not from running away, but from standing still and refusing to give up. Years later, when travelers passed through Blackridge and asked about the homestead on the ridge, people would tell them the story of Clara and Rowan Hale, of how a mail-order bride had arrived to marry a man who didn't want her and had stayed anyway, of how they had fought a mining company and won, of how they had turned a graveyard into a garden. But the real story, the one Clara and Rowan lived every day, was simpler and deeper. It was the story of two broken people who had learned to heal together, of a woman who had refused to accept that nothing could grow in hard ground, of a man who had learned that letting someone in didn't mean losing himself, of a partnership forged in fire and strengthened by every challenge they faced. It was the story of survival becoming something more, becoming a life, becoming a home, becoming love. And on quiet evenings, when Clara and Rowan sat on their porch watching the sunset behind Blackridge Mountain, they didn't see a place that had tried to break them. They saw a place they had claimed, a place they had fought for, a place that was theirs, not because it was easy, but because they had made it so, together.